I walked out of that orphanage with a garbage bag in one hand and a worn envelope in the other, and the laughter followed me all the way down those concrete steps like a chorus of mockery that would echo in my mind for years to come. They thought it was hilarious that I had nothing, no family waiting with open arms at the bottom of those steps, no college fund tucked away somewhere with my name on it, no carefully planned future laid out before me like the other kids who were aging out that same month. The other kids had somewhere to go, someone to call when things got hard, a safety net woven from years of visits and phone calls and promises that someone cared whether they lived or died. But me, I just had that envelope from a social worker named Janet, who looked at me with something between pity and relief, that I was finally someone else's problem, no longer a line item in her overwhelming caseload. Inside that envelope was a name I had never heard before, a woman called Eleanor Crawford, who the papers said was my grandmother, an address to a place called Millbrook County that I had never been to and couldn't find on any map I looked at, and a single line typed on official letterhead that would change everything about my life in ways I couldn't possibly understand at that moment. Your grandmother, Eleanor Crawford, passed away 3 months ago and left you her farm in her last will and testament. I didn't even know I had a grandmother, let alone one who owned land and chickens and a house with a wraparound porch. And as I stood there on that sidewalk with cars rushing past and the city noise drowning out my thoughts and the weight of my entire life packed into a single garbage bag, I felt something crack open inside my chest, something that had been sealed shut and buried deep since I was 5 years old and left on those same orphanage steps with a note pinned to my jacket that said, my mother couldn't do this anymore, couldn't take care of me, couldn't be what I needed her to be. The bus ride to Millbrook County took 6 hours and cost almost all the money I had saved from 3 years of working in the orphanage kitchen, folding laundry until my hands were raw and scrubbing pots until my back ached while the other kids did homework or watched television in the common room, or talked about their weekend visits with foster families who might adopt them someday. I pressed my forehead against the smudged window and watched the city give way to suburbs with neat lawns and swing sets, then to farmland stretching out in every direction, rolling hills covered in crops I couldn't name, corn maybe or wheat or something else entirely, barns that looked like they had been standing for 100 years, weathered wood and rusted metal roofs that somehow still kept out the rain. I wondered what kind of woman my grandmother had been, whether she had been kind or stern, whether she had loved gardening or animals or sitting on her porch watching the sunset, why she had never come for me when I was small and scared and desperate for someone to claim me, never sent a birthday card with money tucked inside, or a Christmas gift wrapped in paper covered with snowmen or reindeer, never let me know that somewhere out there in the world I had someone who shared my blood and my history, and maybe even my eyes or my smile. The envelope had included a key, old and heavy, and made of brass that had tarnished to a deep greenish color, the kind of key that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale about locked towers and hidden gardens, and I kept reaching into my jacket pocket every few minutes to make sure it was still there, solid and real, and slightly warm against my palm from being held so tightly. When the bus finally stopped in Millbrook, a town so small it barely had a main street, just a few shops clustered around a single intersection with a blinking yellow traffic light, I stepped off into air that smelled completely different from the city I had known my entire life. It smelled like earth and grass, and something sweet I couldn't identify, but later learned was honeysuckle growing wild along the fences. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. Without that tight feeling in my chest that had become so familiar, I barely noticed it anymore. I want to pause here for just a moment, because this matters to me more than you might realize, and I need to ask you something while we are right here in this part of the story. If you are listening to these words right now, wherever you are in the world, would you take just a second to write down your location in the comments below this video? Tell me what city or country you are hearing this from. Whether you're in your car during a long commute or in your kitchen making dinner or lying in bed in the middle of the night because sleep won't come and you need something to fill the silence. Knowing that you're out there listening makes this story feel less lonely somehow, makes it feel like maybe we are all connected by these experiences of loss and hope and searching for where we belong. And if you have been enjoying what you are hearing so far, if this story is resonating with something inside you, please take another second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because it helps more people find these stories and maybe find some comfort in knowing they are not alone in what they have survived. The address led me down a dirt road bordered by wildflowers, in colors I had never seen growing wild before, bright yellows and deep purples and soft pinks that swayed in the breeze like they were dancing to music only they could hear, and ancient oak trees that must have been standing there for generations, their branches reaching across the road to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into patches of gold on the ground. I walked for almost 20 minutes, with my garbage bag getting heavier with each step and my feet starting to hurt in the worn sneakers that were the only shoes I owned. And then I saw it rising up ahead of me like something from a dream I didn't know I had been having. A farmhouse painted white with green shutters that hung slightly crooked on their hinges, a wraparound porch with a swing that moved gently in the wind even though no one was sitting in it, window boxes that had once held flowers but now just contained dried stems and dirt, and fields stretching out behind it as far as I could see, acres and acres of land that somehow belonged to me now, even though I had never planted a seed or milked a cow or done any of the 1,000 things that farmers probably did every single day. I just stood there at the end of the driveway with my garbage bag and my envelope and my grandmother's key, unable to believe that this place, this beautiful forgotten place that looked like it had been waiting patiently for someone to come home, was somehow mine to keep or sell or do whatever I wanted with. And I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I blinked them back because I had learned a long time ago that crying didn't change anything and only made you look weak in front of people who were looking for weaknesses to exploit. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, like the house itself was relieved that someone had finally come back after being empty for so long. And I stepped into a space that smelled like dust and lavender, and old wood, and something else I couldn't quite identify, maybe the scent of time itself settling into every corner and crevice. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains that had probably hung in those windows for decades, creating patterns on the hardwood floors that were scuffed and worn, but still beautiful in their imperfection. The furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts of the life that had once filled these rooms, and every surface was coated in a fine layer of dust that showed no one had been here in months, maybe since my grandmother had died and left this place to a granddaughter she had never met. But underneath all the neglect and abandonment, I could see the care that had once been poured into every detail. The hand-stitched quilts folded over chair backs with patterns so intricate they must have taken months to complete. The photographs in silver frames lined up on the mantel showing faces I didn't recognize, but who must have been my family, my history, my blood. The books stacked neatly on shelves that covered an entire wall from floor to ceiling, with titles ranging from farming manuals to classic novels to cookbooks, with pages stained from years of use. I pulled the sheet off the nearest chair and sat down suddenly, exhausted not just from the long journey, but from years of holding myself together with nothing but determination and the refusal to let the world break me completely. And that was when I noticed the photograph directly in front of me on the mantel, positioned as if it had been placed there deliberately for someone to see first thing when they walked into this room. It was a woman with my eyes and my chin and my hands, standing in front of this very house, in what must have been summer because flowers were blooming everywhere, and the sun was bright enough to make her squint slightly. And beside her was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with dark curls and a smile so pure and unguarded, it made my chest ache to look at it. I knew without being told, without needing to check the back of the frame for names and dates, that the woman was my grandmother Eleanor, and the little girl was my mother before drugs and bad decisions and whatever darkness had consumed her life had turned her into someone who could leave her own child on orphanage steps and never look back. I picked up the frame with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and studied every detail like I was memorizing evidence for a test I couldn't afford to fail. The way my grandmother had her hand on my mother's shoulder, protective and proud, the way they were both smiling like they had never known sadness or loss, or the kind of pain that hollows you out from the inside. And I felt something twist inside me, because this woman had existed. She had loved my mother with the kind of fierce love that showed in every line of her body, and somehow I had been left out of that love, cast aside like I didn't matter, like I was disposable trash that no one wanted cluttering up their lives. The house had 3 bedrooms upstairs, each one decorated differently, as if my grandmother had imagined different people living in them someday. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub that must have been original to the house and probably took forever to fill with hot water, and a kitchen that still had canning jars lined up in the pantry, with labels written in careful cursive that slanted slightly to the right. Tomato sauce, peach preserves, strawberry jam, apple butter, pickled cucumbers, all dated from 2 years ago, all made by hands that would never make anything again. I opened one of the jars of peach preserves and tasted it with my finger, and the sweetness exploded on my tongue like summer condensed into a single moment, and I understood that my grandmother had been someone who created beautiful things, who had taken raw ingredients and transformed them into something that could nourish and delight, and I wondered if I had inherited any of that ability, or if I was too damaged by years of institutional living to ever create anything that wasn't just survival. I found my grandmother's bedroom at the end of the hall, her bed made with a patchwork quilt in shades of blue and green that reminded me of the ocean, even though I had never seen the ocean except in pictures. Her nightstand holding a lamp with a faded floral shade, a Bible with a worn leather cover that had clearly been read many times, and a stack of letters tied with kitchen string that had been wound around them so many times it had created grooves in the paper underneath. I sat on the edge of her bed, on the quilt she had probably made with her own hands over countless hours of stitching and measuring and choosing which pieces of fabric would go where, and I untied the string with fingers that wouldn't cooperate because they were shaking so badly. And the first letter I opened was addressed to me in that same careful cursive, dated 6 months before she died, 6 months before I would ever know she existed. She wrote that she had been searching for me for years, ever since my mother had disappeared with me when I was just a baby, running from debts and bad decisions and a drug habit that had taken over her life like a parasite, consuming its host from the inside out. She wrote that she had hired private investigators who charged money she couldn't really afford, but spent anyway because finding me was more important than anything else, called every social service agency in 3 states until they probably recognized her voice, and dreaded seeing her name on their caller ID, spent hours searching through online databases and public records, trying to find any trace of where my mother might have taken me or what might have happened to us after we vanished. She wrote that she had finally found me in that orphanage just 3 weeks before her heart gave out, 3 weeks before a lifetime of hard work and worry and grief caught up with her and stopped her heart in the middle of the night, 3 weeks that weren't enough time to navigate the legal system and prove she was my grandmother and get custody and bring me home where I belonged. She wrote that she had changed her will immediately, calling her lawyer at home on a Sunday evening and making him come to the farm right then because she couldn't wait even one more day, leaving me everything she had, the farm, the house, the land, the bank account she had been saving for the day she would find me and bring me home and make up for all the lost years. She wrote that she was sorry she hadn't found me sooner, sorry she couldn't be there to teach me how to live on this land and work with the seasons and understand the rhythms that had governed her life for 73 years, sorry that all she could give me was this place and the hope that it would be enough to build a life on. Enough to make up for all the years of loneliness and abandonment and believing no one in the world gave a damn whether I lived or died. She wrote that she loved me even though we had never met, loved me because I was part of her daughter, the daughter she had lost first to addiction and then to death, and she hoped that someday I would forgive them both for leaving me alone, for not being strong enough or fast enough or lucky enough to save me from the system that had raised me. She wrote that the farm had been in our family for 4 generations, that her grandmother had homesteaded this land back when this part of the country was still wild and dangerous, that every woman in our family had worked this soil and grown food from it and raised children on it. And she wanted me to know that I came from strong women, survivors who had faced droughts and depressions and personal tragedies that would have broken weaker people. And that strength was in my blood, even if I didn't know it yet. Even if years in the orphanage had convinced me I was weak and worthless, and lucky anyone tolerated my existence at all. I cried sitting on that bed, cried harder than I had cried since I was a child, small enough to still believe that tears might bring someone running to comfort me. And when the tears finally stopped leaving me empty and exhausted, and somehow lighter than I had felt in years, I felt something shift inside me, something that had been hard and bitter and closed off beginning to soften and open, just a crack. I spent the next few weeks cleaning the house from top to bottom, pulling sheets off furniture, and discovering beautiful pieces underneath, washing windows until they sparkled and let light flood into rooms that had been dim for too long, sweeping floors and scrubbing surfaces, and gradually uncovering the home my grandmother had built with her own hands, and her own vision of what a life should look like. I found her garden behind the house, overgrown with weeds that had taken advantage of months of neglect, but still showing signs of the careful rows she had planted, tomato plants that had gone wild and were producing tiny fruits no bigger than marbles, pepper plants that had somehow survived without any care, herb gardens where mint and oregano and thyme were fighting for space with dandelions and crabgrass. I found her barn, a structure that leaned slightly to one side, but was still solid and functional, with tools hanging neatly on the walls, in an arrangement that suggested she had known exactly where everything belonged, a tractor that looked ancient but still ran after I figured out how to prime the engine and turn the key, and stacks of hay that smelled sweet and dry even after sitting there for months, waiting for animals that weren't coming to eat it. I found her chickens, or rather they found me, appearing one morning scratching around the porch looking for the person who used to feed them every day at dawn, and they were half wild now from fending for themselves, but still remembered that humans meant food, and gradually accepted me as an acceptable substitute for the woman they had lost. I started feeding them, scattering grain I found stored in the barn in metal bins that kept it safe from mice and moisture, collecting eggs every morning from nests they had made in corners of the coop, and they gradually came to trust me enough to let me pick them up and check them for mites and trim their wing feathers when they started flying over the fence into the garden. The farm had 40 acres according to the deed I found in my grandmother's desk, most of it fields that had been leased to a neighbor for growing corn, and when he came by to introduce himself and offer his condolences about my grandmother, a weathered man in his 60s named Tom who had known Eleanor for 30 years, he looked at me with surprise that turned to respect when I told him I planned to stay and learn how to work this land myself, rather than selling it to developers who had apparently been circling like vultures even before my grandmother died. Sensing that this land would be valuable if they could just convince whoever inherited it that farming was too hard and too unprofitable and too much work for someone with no experience. The town of Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business within approximately 15 minutes of it happening, and within a week of my arrival, people started showing up at my door with various excuses, but really just wanting to check out the mysterious granddaughter who had appeared out of nowhere to claim Eleanor Crawford's farm. They brought casseroles in dishes they didn't want back, pies that were still warm from the oven, advice about farming that ranged from genuinely helpful to completely contradictory, and offers to help with repairs or painting or any of the 100 projects that came with maintaining a property this size. They told me stories about my grandmother that gradually painted a picture of a woman who had been strong and kind and deeply loved by her community, a woman who had organized church suppers and volunteered at the food bank and helped her neighbors through hard times without ever expecting anything in return. They told me about the quilts she had made for every new baby born in town, beautiful handmade creations that became family heirlooms, the way she had taken in stray animals and sometimes stray people who needed a place to stay while they got back on their feet, the vegetables she had grown in abundance and shared with anyone who needed fresh food, and I began to understand that the love she had wanted to give me but couldn't had instead been poured into everyone around her, creating ripples of kindness that were still spreading through this community years after the actions that created them. An old woman named Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 miles down the road in a house even older than my grandmother's, became my unofficial mentor, showing up several times a week with whatever excuse she could invent to check on me and offer guidance. She taught me how to can vegetables so they would last through the winter, standing in my kitchen for hours showing me how to sterilize jars and prepare produce and process everything in the big pot my grandmother had used for the same purpose, how to read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals and the feel of the air on my skin, how to know when to plant and when to harvest, based on the phases of the moon and the patterns of frost, and a dozen other signs that seemed like magic, but were really just accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of women who had worked this land. She told me stories about my mother as a little girl, wild and sweet, and full of dreams about leaving this small town and seeing the world and becoming someone important. Dreams that had somehow curdled into addiction and desperation and a spiral downward that no one had been able to stop no matter how hard they tried. She told me about the fights between my mother and grandmother, the screaming matches about responsibility and choices and tough love. The night my mother had left at 17 with a boyfriend 20 years older and a car full of stolen belongings, the years of silence broken only by occasional phone calls asking for money to pay for food or rent or whatever, lie my mother was telling herself that week about getting clean and making a fresh start. She told me about the day my grandmother had found out my mother was pregnant with me, how Eleanor had been overjoyed, thinking this might be the thing that finally motivated my mother to get her life together and come home, and how that hope had been crushed when my mother had taken me and disappeared completely, cutting off all contact and leaving my grandmother with nothing but worry and grief and the determination to find us someday. Mrs. Patterson cried telling me these stories, and I realized that my grandmother's loss had rippled through this community too, that everyone who had loved her had shared in her pain, and her fruitless searching, and her eventual death still hoping to find the granddaughter she had never stopped looking for. I learned to hold both versions of my mother in my heart without letting either one destroy me, the innocent child she had been and the broken woman she had become, understanding that people were complicated and flawed, and sometimes the damage done to them was too deep to ever fully heal, but that didn't mean the love was any less real or the loss any less profound. The bank account my grandmother left me had enough money to last a year if I was extremely careful, budgeting every penny and making no unnecessary purchases, and I used it to repair the roof where shingles had blown off during winter storms, fix the plumbing that had started leaking in the upstairs bathroom, replace rotted boards on the porch before someone fell through them, and buy seeds for planting my own crops that spring. I had never grown anything in my life except maybe some mold on bread I had forgotten in the back of my locker at the orphanage, had never even kept a houseplant alive, because what was the point when I would just be moved to a different facility or a different room and have to leave it behind? But I read every book in my grandmother's extensive collection, watched videos online using the satellite internet that was the only option out here in the middle of nowhere, and asked questions of every farmer I met until I began to understand the rhythm of working with land and seasons and living things that depended on me for their survival. I planted tomatoes and squash and green beans and cucumbers and peppers, following the diagrams my grandmother had drawn in her garden journal, showing which plants grew well together and which ones needed to be kept apart. And I spent my days weeding and watering and watching those tiny seeds transform into plants that produced actual food I could eat or sell or preserve for winter months when nothing would grow. There was something miraculous about putting a seed smaller than my fingernail in the ground and having it grow into a plant 6 feet tall that produced pounds of food. Something that felt like magic, even though I knew it was just biology and chemistry and the amazing resilience of living things when given half a chance to thrive. I began to understand why my grandmother had loved this place enough to spend her whole life here, why she had spent decades coaxing beauty and nourishment from this soil, why she had found meaning in work that was hard and sometimes heartbreaking when crops failed or animals died or weather destroyed months of effort in a single afternoon. The physical work was harder than anything I had ever done, harder than scrubbing floors in the orphanage kitchen or hauling trash or any of the dozens of menial jobs I had imagined doing to survive after aging out. But it was also more satisfying, because at the end of each day I could see exactly what I had accomplished, could count the rows I had weeded, or the fence posts I had repaired, or the meals I had made from food. I had grown myself with my own hands. My body got stronger, muscles developing in my arms and legs, and back from lifting and carrying and bending and digging, my hands growing calluses that protected them from blisters, my skin turning brown from hours in the sun, and I began to look like someone who belonged on a farm instead of someone who had just wandered in from the city with no idea what they were doing. By the time autumn came, I had my first real harvest, more vegetables than I could possibly eat or preserve, even if I spent every waking hour in the kitchen canning and freezing, and Mrs. Patterson suggested I set up a stand at the farmer's market that happened every Saturday in the town square. I was terrified standing there behind my table with my baskets of tomatoes and peppers and squash and my jars of jam I had made following my grandmother's recipes, written in her careful cursive in the margins of an old cookbook, terrified that no one would buy anything, that people would see I was a fraud who had no business calling herself a farmer, that I would fail at this just like I had failed at so many other things in my life. But people came, and they bought my produce, and they told me it reminded them of what my grandmother used to sell back before her health started failing, and she had to cut back on the garden. And I realized I was becoming part of this community in a way I had never been part of anything before. Connected not by blood or obligation, but by shared work and mutual respect, and the simple act of growing food that nourished the people around me. A woman my age named Sarah, who ran a bakery in town, started buying my eggs and vegetables regularly, and we became friends in the way that happens naturally when you see someone every week, and gradually start sharing more than just business transactions. She was the first person I told about the orphanage, about the years of feeling invisible and worthless, about being moved from placement to placement because I was too quiet or too angry or too something that made people decide I wasn't worth the effort, about the shock of discovering I had family and an inheritance when I had believed with every fiber of my being that I had nothing and no one, and would die alone and unmissed. She listened without judgment or pity, just genuine interest and compassion, and then she told me her own story of loss and rebuilding, about the husband who had died in a car accident 2 years after they were married, about the baby she had miscarried at 6 months pregnant, about the depression that had nearly killed her until she had discovered that baking bread was a form of therapy that got her out of bed every morning with a purpose. I understood then that everyone was carrying something heavy, that everyone had survived something that had nearly broken them, and that maybe the point wasn't to have an easy life, but to learn how to carry the weight with grace and keep moving forward anyway. I found more letters in my grandmother's desk that winter while looking for tax records and property deeds. Letters she had written to my mother over the years that had apparently been returned unopened, or maybe never sent at all, just kept as a record of everything she had wanted to say. She had written about the changing seasons on the farm, about the first tomatoes every summer and the last frost every spring, about the chickens and the garden and the repairs she was making to the house, filling page after page with ordinary details of her daily life, as if she believed that someday my mother would want to know these things, would want to understand what she had left behind when she ran away. She had written about her worries and her hopes, about lying awake at night wondering where my mother was and whether she was safe, about the phone calls from police stations and hospitals and social workers that came sporadically over the years, bringing news that was never good. She had written about me, about the granddaughter she had never met, but thought about constantly, imagining what I looked like and what I enjoyed doing, and whether I had my mother's eyes or her laugh or her stubborn streak that made her refuse to give up even when giving up would have been easier. She had begged my mother to come home, to get help, to bring me to the farm where we could all be together, and she could help raise me and give my mother a chance to heal from whatever was driving her toward destruction. And those letters were full of a desperation that made my heart ache, because I knew how the story ended, knew that my mother had never come home, had never gotten help, had never given my grandmother the chance to be the parent she had failed to be the first time around. There were letters from my mother, too, fewer and further between as the years went on, full of promises to change, and apologies for the pain she had caused, and excuses that grew more desperate and transparent as her addiction tightened its grip. She wrote about wanting to be a better person, about the rehab programs she was going to start next week or next month, about the job she had lined up, or the apartment she was going to rent, or the fresh start she was going to make in a new city where no one knew her history. And reading those letters was like watching someone drown in slow motion, reaching for anything that might save them, while the water closed over their head inch by inch. The letters stopped when I was 3, and that was when I learned from documents filed with the estate that my mother had died of an overdose in a motel room 2 states away, alone and broke, and using a fake name that had delayed identification for weeks. And that was when I had been taken to the orphanage, when the system had failed to find my grandmother because my mother had been going by a different last name to avoid warrants, running from creditors and bad checks and a trail of people she had used and abandoned. I grieved for the grandmother I never met and the mother I barely remembered. Grieved for all the years we could have had together if addiction hadn't stolen my mother's life and left me alone. But I also felt grateful that I had found this place, that my grandmother's final act of love had given me something solid to build a life on, when I had been prepared to build on nothing but determination and survival instinct. I grieved for the child my mother had been, innocent and full of dreams before something had broken inside her, and I grieved for the woman she might have become if circumstances had been different, if she had gotten help earlier, if addiction hadn't hijacked her brain and turned her into someone willing to abandon her own child to feed a need stronger than any love. And I grieved for myself, for the childhood I never had, for the years of believing I was unlovable and unwanted, for all the times I had cried myself to sleep, wondering what was wrong with me, that even my own mother hadn't wanted to keep me. And slowly, I began to understand that none of it had been about me, that addiction was a disease that made people do terrible things to everyone they loved, including themselves, and that my mother's failures didn't define my worth or determine my future. The second year on the farm, I expanded the garden significantly, adding new beds and planting a wider variety of crops, including things I had never heard of before, but that grew well in this climate according to my grandmother's notes. Added more chickens, including some fancy breeds that laid blue and green eggs that sold for premium prices at the farmer's market, and bought 2 goats that Mrs. Patterson convinced me would be good for milk and cheese and clearing brush from overgrown areas. I named them Bonnie and Clyde because they were constantly escaping from whatever enclosure I built and getting into trouble, eating flowers they weren't supposed to eat, and jumping on cars belonging to visitors, and generally acting like chaos agents. But they were also affectionate and funny, and gave milk that made the most incredible cheese I had ever tasted once Mrs. Patterson taught me the process. I started learning about sustainable farming practices that would honor the land the way my grandmother had, reading about crop rotation and cover crops and building healthy soil, understanding that I wasn't just growing food for this year, but stewarding land that needed to stay productive for generations to come. I made enough money from the farmer's market to pay my bills and start saving for equipment I would need if I was going to make this a real working farm instead of just a large garden, and I began to dream about what else I could do with this place, about the potential I could see everywhere I looked. I thought about offering farm stays for city kids who had never seen where their food came from, who had never collected an egg worm from the chicken or pulled a carrot from the ground, or understood that food required work and patience and care rather than just appearing magically on grocery store shelves. I thought about teaching workshops on canning and preserving and living more simply, sharing the skills my grandmother and Mrs. Patterson had taught me so that others could feel the same satisfaction I felt when I looked at my pantry shelves lined with jars of food I had grown and preserved myself. And I thought about all the kids still in that orphanage where I had spent so many years, still believing they had nothing and no one, still being told directly or indirectly that they were burdens the system was stuck with. And I wanted to show them that life could surprise you in ways both terrible and wonderful, that sometimes the family you never knew existed leaves you exactly what you need to survive, that belonging doesn't always look the way you expect it to, but can be built with your own hands if you're willing to work for it. One morning in early spring of my 3rd year on the farm, I was working in the garden, planting peas along the fence where they could climb and produce food while barely taking up any space, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up the driveway, moving slowly, like the driver wasn't quite sure this was the right place. A young woman got out looking nervous and uncertain, maybe 20 years old, wearing clothes that had seen better days, and carrying a backpack that appeared to contain everything she owned in the world. She introduced herself as Amanda and said she had grown up in foster care, had aged out 6 months ago with nowhere to go and no one to help her, had been bouncing between homeless shelters and friends' couches and her car when she could afford gas, and someone in town had told her my story, and she wondered if maybe I needed help on the farm, if maybe there was room for someone else who was trying to figure out how to build a life from nothing. I looked at her standing there with her backpack, and her hope and her fear all mixed together in her eyes, and I saw myself 3 years earlier, standing on those orphanage steps with my garbage bag. And I told her yes without even thinking about it. Told her there was room. There was always room for someone who needed a place to belong and was willing to work for it. She moved into one of the upstairs bedrooms that afternoon, the room with yellow walls that caught the morning sun and had a view of the fields that I had always thought would be perfect for someone who needed beauty to help them heal. Over the following months, she learned to garden and care for the animals and can vegetables and fix fences and operate the tractor and all the other skills that came with running a working farm. But more than that, she learned that she mattered, that her work had value, that she could create something beautiful with her own hands and didn't need anyone's permission or approval to build a life that felt meaningful. She stopped looking over her shoulder like she expected to be kicked out any second, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped making herself small and invisible, the way kids from the system learn to do to avoid causing problems that might get them moved to a worse placement. She started laughing more and talking about plans for the future and believing that good things could happen to her instead of just bracing for the next disaster. And watching her transform reminded me of my own transformation, of how much I had changed since that first day standing in front of this house, unable to believe it was mine. Other young people came after Amanda, always sent by someone in town who knew someone who needed help, and the farm gradually became a place where people who had aged out of the foster care system could land softly, learn skills that would help them survive and thrive, save money without having to pay rent they couldn't afford, and figure out their next steps in an environment that was supportive rather than judgmental. I never turned anyone away who was willing to work and willing to be part of our little community, and I watched them transform one after another, watched them go from defensive and scared and convinced the world was out to get them to confident and capable and hopeful about their futures. Some stayed for a few months, some for a year or more, but they all left different than they had arrived, carrying with them the knowledge that they could survive anything. They could grow things and build things and create value with their own effort. They could make a life even when they started with absolutely nothing. We worked together and ate together and sat on the porch together in the evenings, talking about our dreams and our plans and the families we wished we had, and the family we were creating right here in this place that had been given to me by a grandmother I never met. We celebrated each other's victories, no matter how small. The first successful loaf of bread someone baked, the first egg collected from a chicken someone had raised from a chick, the first jar of jam that sealed properly and would last through the winter. We supported each other through hard days, when old trauma resurfaced or when the work felt overwhelming, or when loneliness hit hard despite being surrounded by people who cared. We learned together that family wasn't just about blood or legal documents, but about showing up for each other, about creating safety and belonging through consistent care and mutual respect, and the willingness to see each other's full humanity even when it was messy and complicated. I kept my grandmother's photograph on the mantel where I saw it every day, and sometimes I would stand in front of it and tell her about what was happening on her farm, about the young people who were finding their way here, about the community that had formed around her final gift to me, about the life I was building from the foundation she had given me. I told her I understood now why she had searched for me so desperately, spending money and time and emotional energy she could barely spare, why she had left me everything she had, even though we had never met, because she knew what it meant to be lost, and she wanted to give me the tools to be found, wanted to give me something solid to stand on when the world felt like it was constantly shifting under my feet. I told her I forgave her for not finding me sooner, understanding that she had done everything humanly possible and that sometimes circumstances conspire against even the most determined efforts, forgave my mother for the choices that had separated us and ultimately killed her, understanding that addiction was a disease that had stolen her life as surely as any cancer or heart attack, forgave myself for all the years I had believed I was worthless and alone, understanding that children in impossible situations do whatever they need to do to survive, and that survival sometimes requires building walls that take years to dismantle. The farm taught me that growth takes time, that you have to prepare the soil and plant the seeds and water consistently, and wait patiently, and trust the process even when you can't see anything happening beneath the surface, and that the harvest, when it finally comes, is worth every moment of work and faith and uncertainty. It taught me that things can grow in the most unlikely places, that life finds a way even when conditions seem impossible, that beauty and nourishment can come from dirt and difficulty, and things that look dead but are just dormant, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. It taught me that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, that I could learn things I had never thought possible, that I could build a life and a community and a legacy that would outlast me and continue growing long after I was gone. On the 5-year anniversary of the day I arrived at this farm, with nothing but a garbage bag and an envelope, and more fear than hope, I organized a celebration and invited everyone who had helped me along the way, all the neighbors who had brought casseroles and advice in those early overwhelming weeks, all the young people who had stayed here and worked beside me and then moved on to build their own lives armed with skills and confidence they hadn't had before, Mrs. Patterson, who had become the grandmother I never got to know, Sarah, who had become the sister I never had, Tom and the other farmers who had welcomed me into their community and taught me their trade. We set up tables in the yard under the oak trees and filled them with food grown on this land, and as I looked around at all these people laughing and talking and belonging to each other, I felt something I had never felt standing on those orphanage steps with my garbage bag and my envelope and the mocking laughter of kids who thought I had nothing. I felt like I was home, truly home in a way that had nothing to do with buildings or property lines, but everything to do with the connections we had built, the community we had created, the love we had chosen to give and receive. My grandmother had given me more than a farm when she left me this land. She had given me a foundation to build a life on, a place to belong, and the knowledge that I came from people who survived impossible things and kept going anyway. I had taken that foundation and created something that would outlast both of us, something that would keep growing and changing, and offering hope to anyone who needed it, and I understood that this was the real inheritance, not the land or the house or the bank account, but the knowledge that we could transform pain into purpose, that we could take the worst things that had happened to us and use them to create something beautiful for others. That belonging was something we could build with our own hands when the world refused to give it to us. As the sun set over the fields I had planted and tended, as the fireflies began to light up the darkness like tiny floating stars, I thought about that girl who had walked away from the orphanage with nothing, and I wished I could tell her that someday she would stand in a place like this, surrounded by love she had cultivated with her own hands, and she would understand that being abandoned was not the end of her story, but just the beginning of learning what it truly meant to belong, to be wanted, to matter in ways that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined in her darkest moments of believing she was alone in the world.